Curator at the Blaffer Art Museum at the University of Houston. And we are so excited to be presenting part 2 of our dialogue in collaboration with the Holocaust Museum Houston between Simon Fujiwara, Alexandra Zapruder, and Dr. Mary Lee Webeck. And so for all of those of you who joined us January 15th for the first part of this dialogue, welcome back. We're so glad that you're joining us again. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we very much encourage you. The first part of that dialogue is now, it's available on the Blaffer's YouTube page. It's archived there, and so just visit our website. You can find your way to it. I very much encourage you to view that and review it. And we will continue off of that today. Very excited. And we want to kind of launch right into the dialogue. So I'm going to give very brief introductions to the panelists, just for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and then we're going to launch right into the dialogue. So Alexandra Zapruder is an author, a guest curator, and an educator. She was a guest curator for one of the permanent exhibitions at the Holocaust Museum, surveying diaries of young writers during the Second World War. Dr. Mary Lee Webeck first joined the Holocaust Museum of Houston in 2006 as the Director of Education, and she is now the Endowed Chair of Education at HMH. And Simon Fujiwara is an artist based in Berlin who currently kind of semi-opened an exhibition at the Foundation Prada in Milan. I heard, Simon, that you had to launch it on Instagram, and it will soon launch in person. And Simon is also the current artist that we are featuring at the Blaffer, who orchestrated the exhibition Hope House. And I very much want to encourage you to come see the exhibition if you haven't. This is the closing weekend. We opened it in October. It will now be up until March 14th. It's kind of hard to see it go goodbye. We've really become accustomed to walking through the show and living with Anne Frank here at the Blaffer, or at least the likeness of her. And so it's a tremendous exhibition, and we are free. We're open noon to 5. Please come see the show if you haven't. This is your last chance this weekend. And Simon has spent multiple years really studying Anne Frank, as well as the museum, the architecture, the industry that has been built around this young girl's legacy and likeness. And so we're going to hand it off to Simon first to talk about Anne Frank, as well as that transition to the Anne Frank Museum and the idea of authenticity, audience, and experience. And so Simon's going to give us some framework, and then we're going to open it up to the panelists. So Simon, and I just want to thank Scott and Judy Nyquist, who sponsored this program, and all of our supporters. So with that, hand it off to Simon.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's very sad that it's the end of the exhibition, but things go so fast. I just wanted to give like a five or 6 minute framing of the conversation today, because this is part 2 of a dialogue that we had, and we decided that what we missed from the first conversation was a discussion that we were entering, which is about the concept of reconstructions, of creating experiences that mimic or try to bring us into the stories of Holocaust survivors or Holocaust experiences, or traumatic historic experiences in general, and what that means when that in today's world, where we have kind of new technologies, we have social media, we have hypercapitalism, we have a lot of money on the side of representation, what it means to be representing tragic historical events in the light of kind of 21st century entertainment capitalism, and how that affects the meaning and what museums work is. And where I come from in this discussion is from my experiences of visiting the Anne Frank house, and very simple, straightforward observations of someone who didn't really know very much about what this experience was going to be or what it means, except my preconceptions, which were that it would be a very solemn place, a very authentic place. I believed that it would be going into the rooms that Anne Frank and her family had hidden. And I almost imagined it, because I'd seen so many ways in which historic places represent the past as a kind of set up, like a set, you know, where you'd see the glasses and the water cup and the actual diary and the pen just left as it was, because that's sort of how I imagined through the kind of even Hollywood imaginary or the way other museums represent the past, I would be consuming the Anne Frank story at the house. It wasn't that. There were empty rooms at the Anne Frank house. But one thing I did learn was that the house had been renovated and redesigned to allow visitors to come. And this kind of blew my mind. I thought, wow, like, how can the Anne Frank house be touched by an architect? Is it still real then? Is it still authentic? So that was one question that kind of started to filter into my mind. And I thought, well, of course, it's a place that hid something like 8 people for a number of years, that is now visited by over 1 million people a year. So just the logistics of getting 1 million people through hiding places is an absurd proposition, you know. And so that's one kind of question that I want to flesh out in this discussion. And the second is around the products that the Anne Frank House sell in their museum store. Now, there were 2 items that I bought. One was, in fact, let me just get one up here.
It's so cool he's in his studio, so he can just run up and get what he needs.
It might be my studio, but it might be a reconstruction of my studio. So here's a model that the museum store sell of the Anne Frank house. You can see the scale of it. And it has these flanking walls that are kind of disappeared. It's a terrace house, which I just refixing together, that has the sides open, so you can actually look into the house and see the kind of rooms. It's an educational tool. That's the way it's branded. And it's true that it had an educational quality, because I really did engage with the story as I was building it, but I also had this perverse feeling of having control over the Anne Frank house. Why should I be able to decide where the walls go? You know, I had been given this weird freedom to like make a new bathroom or to expand the kitchen of the Frank family. And this I thought was not really right to be thinking about. So I questioned my own morality and became quite uncomfortable in the process of doing something which is billed as an educational tool. Another is a blank diary that is sold there that encourages people to write their own experiences, and the design is loosely based on Anne Frank's diary. Again, transposing what would I write in a facsimile of Anne Frank's diary. Uncomfortable questions, but the important thing to remember is that all of the proceeds of these objects go back into charities that fund important work in fighting anti-Semitism or broadening knowledge around injustices, racial injustice, religious injustice, lots of different educational programs that the Anne Frank House run as a not-for-profit entity that isn't government supported. And these objects really ask me the question of what does it mean that these historical traumas need to be packaged and sold for us in the 21st century capitalism, for us to not only engage with them, but for these issues to be supported, because as we know, as the governments recede from everything and everything is privatized, we need to find ways to pay for things. So we get the Anne Frank House as a little model, you know, and what we lose some things with that, we lose a sense of perhaps the aura around the trauma of the Anne Frank history. Like, we should never touch this. This should be a museum. It should be only dealt with by academics or historians. And we get a democratic vision where my 2-year-old niece could be playing with this and it's in her mouth, and you're like, is this right? Is it wrong? We have control of these things. So there's a give and a take in what we do when we unleash these things into the popular world. So that's the second thing, is like, what does it mean to be reconstructing, remaking under the pressures of the 21st century? And the third is around technology and representation. And that is stemming from something that recently was launched, actually last year in March. I think it was in the first lockdown. The Anne Frank House launched a series of video diaries on YouTube. And it asked a very simple question: what if Anne Frank had a camera? And it translates her diary into a vlog, a video log, a video diary. And you see Anne Frank it's very, you know, the Anne Frank House produced it, so it's historically very faithful, and their intentions are, of course, to educate. That is not there to create entertainment, it's not there to sell advertising space, it's there to educate. That is their point. Yet we see Anne Frank with a camera, acting like a teenager would, telling her diary to camera. And they're very honest, the house. They don't hide their intentions. And their main intention is that the form of reading is becoming obsolete. It's hard to get children to read. What children really like is watching videos, and they love YouTube. So if we can get Anne Frank onto YouTube, is the way they think, we can get a much bigger audience for her. And what does an audience for Anne Frank mean? It means an audience to understand the horrors of fascism, to understand through a personal lens, politics, you know? And that seems like a very good thing. So if it means putting Anne Frank on camera, that's a trade-off that seems to be okay. Again, I watched it. It was moving at times. It was harrowing at times. It was banal at times in the way YouTube videos are. What I left with was a sense that, and this is very personal because I'm not a teenage girl, and teenagers is kind of where the target audience for this video is. So I must be very clear that it's not intended for 38 going on 39-year-old gay mixed race middle-aged men. I might not be that target audience, but I was the audience. And I had a very different experience than when I read the book. When I read the book, as one does when one reads, you can conjure up a character in your mind, and you can do somewhat an editing process, right? So I was like, this chick is super smart. She's super sassy. She is the kind of girl that answers back. She's really cool. She's X, Y, and Z. Like, I just conjured up the girl that I wanted with Anne Frank. When I saw her on camera, I had to follow what she really was, you know, and sometimes she was annoying, and sometimes she was bratty, and sometimes I found her a little fake. And I was judging the performance of an actor on a YouTube video. And that is fine, unless perhaps that leads to equals judging Anne Frank, because that isn't fine. So I wasn't sure what, I mean, I know I can separate the two. I wasn't judging Anne Frank, I was judging the production design and the scripting and the directing. But not everyone can do that, and maybe not young people. So again, it might gain an audience. Is that audience experiencing the real thing? What is the real thing? Does it matter if we have an authentic Anne Frank story, but nobody knows about it anymore because no one's interested in the way it's mediated? What is the point of that? Mm-hmm. So those are questions moving forward that I think are really seminal and really challenging for places like the Holocaust Museum, I imagine. And I've been studying different museums just out of interest for my work, but also in general, that deal with tragedy and how they get tickets and how they create an experience out of it. And now my 5-minute thing has turned into longer than 5 minutes. So I want to just start by asking Mary Lee, because last time we were talking about the train carriage at the Holocaust Museum, which I noticed on your website, and whether that is a real, authentic carriage that, in my mind, I don't know what the museum, what exactly is there, but the moment I see that, I think deportation to concentration camp, right? And I think, do I want to go into that? Should that be in a museum, that real thing? What is that thing doing in America? You know, like, especially now when we also think about ecology, like, why has that thing been transported across the ocean? What kind of experience does that provide? And is it right, wrong, interesting? Does it generate empathy? Does it generate healing to put people in those spaces? And is it even a real Holocaust-related carriage? So I'll leave it to you, Mary, to maybe talk a little bit about how you negotiate that in the work that you do in creating physical spaces.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Because Alex and I have been involved in Holocaust Museum work now for a number of years. And the issue of rail cars and authenticity is an issue that is a part of ongoing decision-making in museum design and exhibit design. But I'm going to take a moment and use some privilege that I have right now and blow a kiss to my daughter, who is online here and who is situated right across town from Simon. And I keep telling her that the two of them and Raphael, her significant other, need to get together because they're like-minded. So hi, Kelly, darling. Thank you for being with us today. And we could start the PowerPoint, please. Okay, so for those of you in Houston, you know this, this scene. This is on the main thoroughfare in the museum district in Houston. And this is where the rail car is going to be situated, not in this outside building, which is outside of the parking lot, but in the interior. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the rail car that is on exhibition at Holocaust Museum Houston. It was transported, as Simon said, across the ocean from Germany. This is an authentic car, and we know that because it has been analyzed very carefully and documented, and the toolery on it has been looked at very, very carefully, the construction of the car, etc. So I want you to look closely at this image for just a minute, and you'll see a cement floor on the right-hand side of the image. And then what else do you see? And you don't have to say it out loud, but just think about this. When I look at this, I see another artifact that's peeking out from behind the rail car, and that is a Danish rescue boat. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition and positioning in our museum of these two artifacts, which represent, to me at least, choices that were made by people in the actions they took during the Holocaust to be someone who was complicit in the transportation of Jews, whether you were a guard, whether you worked for the railroad, or to be someone that was somehow responsible or involved in rescue of Danish Jews in a boat like this rescue boat that's there. One of the decisions that had to be made at our museum as we were considering the placement of this car, and both of these artifacts used to be outside in Houston. So our ability when the museum was expanded to move them inside was quite a move in the right direction in terms of preservation of artifacts, because in Houston, you can imagine the humidity and the moisture that was damaging and eroding these two artifacts and caused them to need much, much care. But the construction and where this car is, if you look down at the bottom, you'll see glass. And if you look through the glass, you'll see the wheels of the car, and you'll also see train tracks. This was done to help people think about this car and its ability to move at one point in history. You'll also notice the door is opened, and you can't see what's on the other side of the door from where this photograph was taken. But the positioning of this car in our exhibition was strenuously negotiated to be a position where people would have a choice to walk around the car, to enter into it. And I would say about 3/4 of our visitors do make the choice to enter into the car. However, it's not something that we can demand of people. Many Holocaust survivors are unable to walk inside of the car because for them, even this vicarious experience of being inside a car is too close to memories of people in their own families or people they cared about very much in their experiences during the Holocaust. I've been in museums where you have no choice but to walk through, and I have watched the hesitation and the dread of visitors as they come to that point and they have no choice but to go through. Alex, is there anything you want to add to this discussion?
I just want to actually mention, sorry to jump in, but I think that's a really interesting point about participation.
Yep.
Because I think one of the things that I was confronting with, I made a reconstruction of the Anne Frank house. You know, this is on paper, this is kind of recreating a site that could be seen as a site of trauma by some, by others, a site of hope and a message of goodness. And in the process of recreating it, you know, I really questioned, like, what does it mean to make people participate in this, to put people through that? And one of the answers to myself, I suppose, and you know, this is never resolved because it's an artwork that is challenging, and you know, it does continue to ask these questions. One of the answers I had was, well, first of all, the house itself exists as a template. The house is a set of spaces that you do go through in a way that you can't really leave. You know, it's a parkour. But what I found so interesting about the, I don't know if you can see the screen again, or about the model, about recreating the model, was that the side walls were missing. And that if I recreated the model, I would create a version of the Anne Frank house that was open rather than closed. And you could walk in and out, not through the route that's prescribed, but you could enter it at any point that you wish to, and you could leave it at any point you wish to. And what that for me was a metaphor of was the idea that in life today, in contemporary life, we are much more accustomed to having choices of how we engage with everything, right? To the point where we now put disclaimers on everything before it happens. So, you know, any TV show that's going to have a scene of violence or speak about eating disorders or whatever, any kind of traumatic issue has a disclaimer first that says, this is going to happen to you. And you can choose even like if you're going to have that experience before. So I thought, okay, well, this really mimics the way that culture is going in general, which is, well, this version of the Anne Frank house is the version that you can choose. You know, is that more traumatic as a thought or less? You know, should one be allowed that? You know, and I think the question of participation, I mean, Alexandra, you, in your exhibition at the museum, you were going to talk about how you dealt with people participating with the stories of the diaries that you presented.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there are a lot of things going through my head. I mean, the diaries exhibition is at Holocaust Museum Houston is very different because there's no, you know, there is no sort of recreated there's no environment that mimics a recreation. And I mean, interestingly, diaries themselves invite us to view things through the eye of the person who experienced it almost more than any other form, except for possibly a letter, because they're written in real time and as events occur. And so even without trying, you know, a diary can sort of collapse the distance. But I was thinking a little bit about the rail car because, you know, I was on the founding staff of the Holocaust Museum in DC. And of course there's a rail car there too. And I wasn't on the team of people who were having these debates, but I recall that they were being had. And one of the questions was sort of, was it important, for example, for people to be able to walk straight through it, the shortest possible distance, or enter on one side and have to, for example, walk the length of it and then exit? You know, this is the minutia of the question of like, how much are we asking of people? And the question I always wonder is, like, what do we think we're accomplishing by having someone walk through a rail car? Like, even if you do walk through a rail car, like, what is the feeling that we think we are creating or inviting people to have? You know, And how much are we, like, what's the point of that experience, basically? Like, what does it do for you as a visitor? And I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a very good answer for it. I mean, I certainly I've walked through my share of rail cars, and there is something about standing inside it and trying to sort of feel the physical space. And but then again, you're in there by yourself or with a few other people. It's not crowded. It's not actually going to Auschwitz. It's not, you're not starving, you're not terrified. So I don't know. It's a very, very, it's something that has always kind of puzzled me. And sometimes I think we want to orchestrate experiences for people that will make them feel something, but it's still so far away. And what's from the real thing? And what's the virtue of that? What are we teaching, really? So I want
to, I'm gonna stop you there, Alex, because I want to move on to another point in this conversation that working with Alex and Simon on these discussions has really, really made me think about and return to. And I want to say before I go here that I want to thank Simon for his innate thoughtfulness and his ability to really, really, really deal with the issues that that we face in the world of memorialization and education. If you could go to the next slide. Both Alex and I, and Simon, I think vicariously, have had experiences with what is called in the education world simulation. And in preparation for our work today, I went to the internet just because I haven't checked this for about 6 months and I wanted to see what was happening yesterday. And I typed in Holocaust simulation. And I would urge you all to do that, to see the number of references that you will find to how to do simulations about the Holocaust. And the idea of simulation is to try to put someone in a position where they are feeling as authentically as possible what the experience of someone who lived at that historical time might have been. And before we opened the floor of this today, I was saying that we, one of the things that both Alex and I know from working with educators is that they love the concept of simulation. And I have had educators that I respect almost go to battle with me with drawn swords when I say to them, please do not use simulations when you teach the Holocaust, because they believe that what they are doing is helping their students to understand. So in the chat, I have put links to 3 documents for you that talk about the concept of simulation and why it is not an appropriate pedagogical choice for teaching about the Holocaust or teaching about genocide or teaching about other traumatic historical events. I have also placed 2 documents in there that list guidelines. One set of guidelines comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the other comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Both of them are very important. And I said to Simon, it's like you had internalized all of these and put these into your work. So again, thank you to Simon for really being on target. But I want to come to this middle bullet point that's here. And if you steam down all of the work about why we don't want to simulate, and I think this is also an important question for museum practice. How is it that we best convey the understanding and the historical reality and the historical accuracy and the individual storying that's necessary to understand events such as the Holocaust without simulation? And the one thing I really want you to think about, it is not possible to simulate the complexity of the experiences that people had during the Holocaust. I can't put you know, my 30 middle school students under a table in the library and cover it with a dark cloth and expect them to pop out 3 or 4 or 5 minutes later, having understood what it was like to be in a rail car being deported. Or the other way that simulation is used, oftentimes in educational settings, is to understand what it was like to be in the hold of a slave ship. Now, intellectually, all of us are saying, well, hooey, that's not going to work. But, you know, why is it that educators find it so compelling to do these things? So if these questions are of interest to you, I would urge you to go and look at these documents, because they talk about authenticity of language and, you know, telling the individual story as the diaries do, using historical context. And I'll leave it there because there's more. And I always like to assign tasks for people to do. You know, I'm the educator here. I always want to give people something to carry on and think about and do as a result of our conversation. But once again, thank you to Simon and to Alex for the ability to have these conversations.
One of the things I think that I think there's a question, this idea of recreating an experience as a form of pedagogy is very much linked to how we represent the Holocaust in movies, in theater, online, and not just the Holocaust, but all complex forms of historical events or things, anything to do with identity, you know, race, gender, all of these things, that we live in times that are very, very complex questions around these, and nobody has answers for them. It's actually a kind of a revolutionary time where there are many, many more questions than there are answers, and people are not, people are, you know, fighting and holding ground and developing super extreme positions on things. And I think one of the purposes of doing things like simulation or video diaries is to try to create some kind of engagement in a really simple way, because those things do work, you know, they actually do function on creating some kind of understanding of the Holocaust, I think, more than a lecture might, because what you know, the Anne Frank House know they're fighting, for example, when they create the video diaries, is how are we going to get 9-year-old kids to sit and read a book today? You know, and that might be what some educators are thinking, like, we're going to be showing black and white photos from the past, people that they don't connect to at all, and we need to tell them to care about this. This is really difficult. And so it's a step, a kind of, I would say provocatively, maybe an easy step, a way to get people engaged with it, but it doesn't lead to the ultimate goal, which is but because what I think is, when someone internalizes and imagines something, that is when they get a grasp of it. Right?
So there's a couple of things that I'd like to jump in and say here, because I mean, a few things. First of all, you know, the beginning of my career was forged in creating Remember the Children, Daniel's Story, the museum's exhibition for young visitors, which is an entirely built out, it's built out environments that kids walk through. It's totally interactive. It's so you're literally walking through these spaces. And we developed this exhibition, you know, 30 years ago. And one of the huge challenges was exactly what you're talking about. How do you get kids to connect and be engaged in the story without being inappropriate and simulating or making dioramas, basically, of the events? And the way that we did it aesthetically was to create these sort of whimsical spaces that were clearly not literal spaces. The way that we positioned it was sort of like a memory of a space. So there were pieces of environments, parts of a family household, a German street, you know, a ghetto room. And these were, and there's a lot of content being delivered in those spaces. But, you know, I think that's where artists kind of come in is, there is something between, it only has to be like the pure historical sources, or it has to be this Disneyland. Exactly. And we were accused, this exhibition is now very much loved, but when we were creating it, there were people on the founding staff of the museum who were not working with us, who accused us exactly of that thing, that we were creating this Disneyland experience, which wasn't it at all. It was trying to find this line between engagement and interactivity and some things that were tactile and tangible and that you could manipulate so that kids would be involved, but all the while keeping them at a safe distance. And I think, again, the question becomes, and I ask myself this question a lot, when you're talking about the Anne Frank vlog, for example, or the rail car or the simulation, like, again, the question is, what's the point? Like, there's such an emphasis on how important it is for people to have a feeling about something, that like, we have to make sure that students are having a feeling. And I question that sometimes, like, you will have a feeling because you'd have to have a heart of stone not to have a feeling, but is it the goal to have a feeling? Is that the goal? And at what point? And my objection, of course, with the simulation, even more than anything else, is that you're simulating experiences of the Holocaust is effectively inflicting the Holocaust on somebody. Like, you're becoming a kind of perpetrator who is creating an environment in which someone has to suffer in order to understand something. And that is deeply problematic. It also, in my view, it conveys the exact opposite message. It doesn't cultivate empathy. Instead, it cultivates fear, and it cultivates, it sort of recreates a kind of pain. We've heard stories, horrific stories of teachers who've tried to, get their students not to eat lunch all week, in an attempt to sort of replicate the kind of hunger that people experienced during the Holocaust. It's inane.
I think in answer to what you're kind of getting at, my go-to is, to try to think, well, I don't think anyone would be actively trying to create pain. I don't think that's anyone's goal, generally, especially at a museum level. I think generally these experiences are about, the end goal is normally the justification for all of them, which is to create more knowledge, to create more empathy. That is the kind of end goal. And that is what sort of justifies all of the means of getting there, however weird and twisted and experiential they might end up being. And as we move into an experience economy where things are starting to fight each other, because there is now a choice of, do I go to Madame Tussauds or Anne Frank House when I'm in Amsterdam? Like, they're pitched on a similar level of a consumable experience, right? When we see things presented side by side like that, it's inevitable that the Anne Frank House, for example, it has reviews on Yelp. Like, people go, oh, that was disappointing. Like, oh, it took me so long to get to the cafe. Like, just stuff that you're like, you see that it's got into a weird market where it's become a consumable. And I think that logic of the consumable is really interesting, because I think there was a point, and I can't really locate where it was, but it was somewhere in my childhood where I started to see museum going needing to be an experience, right? And it really changed. It changed from being like, the museum was something where you'd be like, achoo, I'm gonna like sneeze and it's gonna be this dusty old place, to like, whoa, did you hear about that thing they have at the museum, right? And it becomes about being able to consume a story and retell that story, because what's happened in my lifetime is the individual has become all important.
Right.
And what I experienced matters. And then everything starts to cater to that. So the Holocaust Museum in Houston, I can imagine a discussion, I'm not saying this is what happened, but I can imagine a discussion that says, if people are going to come here, they need to tell their friends over dinner, like, I went to the Holocaust Museum, I saw some photos, black and white photos, and I read some really interesting texts. They're like, I was in a Holocaust carriage.
But
That's a story that like makes people go, wow, that's an experience. I can picture myself in that. I can see it. I want to do it. And I know it's really horrific what I'm saying, but that is how it works with every other experience in life. So why should that not be how it also is weirdly functioning with these trauma sites? I believe that is the case to an extent.
Okay, so I would like to introduce a scholar whose work has been very significant in my thinking about how museums operate. And that person's name is Elizabeth Ellsworth. And she has written significantly about experience in Holocaust museums in a way that I think affects our ability to think about experiences in most any kind of museum. And so some of the people from Houston that are on the call that are docents have probably heard me talk about this before. But Dr. Ellsworth talks about flex points in an exhibit that a person comes to, and it causes them to shift ever so slightly, perhaps physically, perhaps in their thinking. And this is one of the things that, Simon, you did magically in this exhibit that we're talking about broadly today, because you have filled it with opportunities for people to think, to turn, and be exposed to questions and have to think again. And, you know, one of the things that in the projects that Alex and I have worked on together, it has been a constant concern. What do we want people to think about? In what order do we want to present things to folks so that they start to form questions and they go away from the exhibit, as you both have said, with the ability to engage in, hopefully, in new ways. I know, Stephen, at the Blaffer, one of the things that you all have enjoyed so much about the exhibit is the way this exhibit differently has dealt with your participants and how they have had really profound experiences as they've been dealing with their questions and I think there are perhaps new identities as a result of asking those questions.
No, absolutely. And I just want to thank all of this is just such a stimulating conversation and dialogue. And it really has my wheels turning, because the question that I want to sort of pose to all of us is how the museum operates within the experience economy, or should it operate in the experience economy? Because there's one item within Simon's show that are 2 tickets from the Apartheid Museum that give that these tickets are issued, and they are whites and
in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, and I wonder, Simon, I wanted to ask you, you know, what was that experience like? Because I can say, you know, personally, I recall being a teenager going to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto and going into one of those slave ship experiences when they put you into a dark little cabin and they close the door and they leave you in there, exactly what you were saying. And I still remember that today, you know?
Can I just say one thing? I want to just jump in with one thing, if I may, because I finally realized something you said, Simon. My wheels have been going and I've been trying to figure this out. And this is what I keep thinking about. You said, you know, something about knowledge and empathy and feelings, right? And I think one of the challenges that we have in museums, but we also have it as educators, even outside of the museum world, is when we go straight to feeling without the knowledge piece, right? When the thing that is being sold, in quotes, is a feeling. Oftentimes it's a cathartic experience, right? But if that happens without the knowledge part of it, if it doesn't come with real grounded understanding, then I think it's, in my view, it can have a cheapening effect. And so I think a lot of us struggle with what is effectively a kind of sentimentalizing or romanticizing or a mistaken idea that you've learned something just because you've had a feeling about it, rather than engaging in the difficult work of actually learning. Because if you actually learn, you will have a feeling. The problem is, and I really struggle with this because I think, there is a real pressure that you're talking about, Simon, which is, okay, that's all well and good, middle-aged white lady, but how are you going to get the kids? How are you going to get the kids? And, we do ask her, when we did a documentary based on Salvaged Pages with MTV, this was the question, like, how much compromise are we going to have to make in order to create something that will be palatable for this audience? And where do we find that line between holding what is true about it, conveying the information, and yet packaging it in a way that doesn't, totally go over their heads? And this is a line I think that we're all walking all the time, basically.
Absolutely. I think that there's other forms of intelligence that haven't been mined that museums can do much more, and that don't have to fall entirely into entertainment. But I think that it's inevitable that entertainment is now part of our realities, and it's going to be moving forward, because
entertainment isn't
how we negotiate that. Like, if we can do that intelligently, because to be stimulated, excited, and suspended, that to me is entertainment. Like, to be held by something, captured, and that can be super brain stimulating, body stimulating, or both. And it can contain something more. It doesn't mean that there's a hierarchy of like, the message is more important than the medium, And in this exhibition, what I really tried to do was to create haptic experiences where you could see the broom that people in London use to clean up after riots, largely race riots, or by young disenfranchised people, or the makeup powder that Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, wears, like as a kilograms of piles, to just create some kind of break that I don't know if it's successful. That's not what I'm trying to get at, because I don't think I can decide on a successful path. What I can do is disrupt what is current forms of exhibiting, and hopefully embed in the experience of looking at those things to give you a kind of view outside of yourself and see yourself looking at them and going like, I'm also in a museum looking at Angela Merkel's powder in Anne Frank's house. Is that wrong or right? Like, and it stems to what Stephen was asking me earlier, which is like, what is the take home personally of going to the Apartheid Museum in South Africa and being given a ticket where you're color cast as white or non-white, right? I wasn't even thinking about my own like racial relationship to that, because I was totally thinking about black and white South Africa. So I wasn't like going, oh my God, this is super traumatic for my own racial experiences at all. I was just like, I'm at a museum and they want me to do this. Those experiences are so complex. I'm so disgusted by them, but so fascinated that I have to sort of just kill myself and turn into an alien and just go, I'm just going to look at everything and experience it all. Because if I go into this as a human, I'm going to like start tearing the walls down or something. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to burst into tears because it just feels so hopeless. But at the same time, in all of that, there is this will of humans to, what they're trying to do is communicate. And it might not always be the right way.
For sure.
But there's a desire there. And that's what I try to honor in when I speak about it or represent it, is even when it goes wrong for me, it might be going really right for someone else. It might be creating something else. And I just can't be the one that judges that. But it is an incredibly fertile place to think through general problems about humanity that are, believe it or not, even more important maybe than historical problems. That might be controversial to say, but there are things that we're living with now.
Right.
I
think they're the same. I don't know that it's more or less. They're different versions of the same, historical problems or past versions of what we're grappling with now.
But I think, yes, it's troubling to think of Anne Frank being reduced to a kind of IKEA version of her life. That is troubling. it's also troubling that IKEA exists. You know what I mean? That is a really scary thing, that there's a template coffee table in every person's home in every country in the whole world. Like, that is scary. You know, but it's somehow, for me to get to us thinking about that, I have to go through this, because we're more willing to emote over something being done to Anne Frank because she's an idea to us, than the violence of this capitalist world operating on us, because we don't often think of things being done to us as violent as they are. We don't always recognize that, I think.
So
because they're packaged as pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting close to the end of the hour. So I just maybe, you know, I want to open it up to audience questions, but maybe I just want to pose one question to our panelists. And I think what we're, you know, ultimately getting at here is, what are the most sensitive exercises of adaptation or translation? Essentially, I feel like that's what the museum is wrestling with when you're trying to convey, you have this level of historical responsibility to try to protect the integrity of that historical material. And like you said, Simon, to communicate it in an impactful way to the next generation and the next generation after that. And so it almost necessitates that form of translation, that you're going to have to adapt the language to still convey the impact of that material. And how is that done in a sensitive way that doesn't seem like it's, you know, disrespecting the content?
I think it touches on what Alexandra was saying, which is so hard to choose from your own perspective, because I could say, you know, I love the way the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin functions, for example, you know, but I also studied architecture and I just love concrete. You know, there's things, and it has no information, and it leaves you to just imagine and experience it as a body. But I know so much already, so that isn't the place where that's not the place I think humans learn about atrocities.
Right. I mean, I think
there is
a distinction.
So I'm just like, maybe not the right audience. That's the one I love. So that is, of course, yeah. Okay. But I'm thinking just of sensitive portrayals of tragic, sensitive portrayals or places. You know, I do tend towards those, but I see that as really problematic in myself. You know, that's definitely not something that is enough.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just this conversation just makes me wonder about, you know, what you've said, Simon, is so interesting and challenging in a lot of ways, because I think, you know, we all bring our biases to these, which is sort of what you're saying. You know, my bias is towards the historical record. And to me, that is the Holy Grail. You know, that's what I come back to. And, you know, that isn't necessarily true for everyone. And it's not, and I'm not suggesting that it's the only way to get to understanding and meaning. It's not, there is some other thing, you know, you can get there other than through a cognitive lens. You know, when we were developing Daniel's story, it was all about this balance between the cognitive and the affective. You know, for kids, it was, what do you need to learn and what do you need to feel? You know, and what makes a whole experience out of that. And so I think, you know, these are very, very difficult questions. And I think we're all compromising, you know, we're all working to figure out, you know, how do you tell these stories, and how do you communicate this information in a complex world, a changing world, without making too many compromises to the past or to ourselves, and without underestimating what human beings can and will do. You know, there's always the question, if you create the vlog, kids will watch it. But if there is no vlog and there's only the book, maybe kids will read it. Maybe they will. We don't know that. So it's really difficult. It's interesting. Good questions, I think.
Mary Lee, maybe I can ask you to sort of give me one.
Yeah. So last night I heard a really fascinating speaker, and it was a panel about anti-Semitism. And the last question posed by the moderator was, he wanted to say, what the hell do we do to move forward? But instead he just said, how do we move forward? And one of the scholars gave a particularly significant response to me, and I've been thinking about it ever since. He said, we educate to recognize. And I've been thinking about our talk today and what we each do in our work and how we do try to recognize. And for each one of us at different times in our experience, you know, as curators, as artists, as thinkers, as writers, we have to deal with the big question is, what is it that we want people to recognize at this moment? And you know, and I think in this historic moment in which we live, there are so many things and so many points in this discussion. I wish we could go on talking for hours and hear from the audience too, what you are thinking about answers to these questions. So for me, I know that I want people to recognize how we can stimulate democracy in this time in which we live when there are so many challenges. How can we do that through our work, teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about and through Reconstruction, teaching about human decision-making? Because the crux of all this is what human beings make choices to do.
I think the whole kind of question about like, what is the answer to this is a problem. You know, because I think the answer is, how can we make this more complex?
Exactly.
You know, how do we make this
problematize?
How do we make it as complex as it really is, and yet make it still consumable to a level that people can understand? It just doesn't completely go over their heads. Right. But also, how can we also learn from other disciplines and combine things? So how can we make this, you know, a more intersectional experience as well? You know, how can we like cross with like racial discussions and feminism with Holocaust and memory and experience and entertainment capitalism? How can we combine things that fight another big problem, which is capitalism, you know, hyper-capitalism, and the fact that what we're really talking about is everything is bending to that one thing.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's all we're really sitting here talking about. That's the big enemy. We can discuss, you know, if we just, I mean, of course, I don't have an alternative to that. So we have to talk about around it and why, but that's the reason why all of these things are happening. And I think if we can think of like, how can we create engaging experiences, museum experiences that are resistant to capitalism, that share information in non-capitalist forms, you know, like that is a really important question, I think, and one that is progressive. So I don't think there ever should be an answer, because every generation should find their own problems in how we think about the past and rip down memorials and build them again. You know, like it should constantly be under question, is what I'm saying.
Evolving,
I just think that the best way for that to happen is to think how to make it progressive and complex, because that feels resistant to the main problem at the moment, which is everything is reduced and simplified. And that is just making everything really, really stupid, but really easy to sell.
Yeah.
Well,
Stephen, do you want to throw out an opportunity for people to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes, we've had such a great audience. So I do want to throw it like, please just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, this is Jerry Rockman, and I guess I address this question to Mary Lee. As a docent at Holocaust Museum Houston, do we need to rethink now how we teach the rail car and what we talk about when we talk about the rail car?
I think if you talk about the rail car, as I phrased it today, in the context of human decision making, by the choices that were made, I think when we talk about the rail car, we have to be historically accurate, Jerry, but we also have to make it complex. In the last few years, one of the understandings about the use of rail cars is a misrepresentation of the mythology that went on for so many years, that the railroad did everything that the Nazis asked. And in fact, they didn't. And their main thing was, back to Simon and capitalism, their main focus during the Holocaust was on being a economically strong organization. And they factored in what the Nazis wanted, but it didn't control their choices. So that's, you know, one thing that could be added to the discussion for sure. I'm not sure that I've answered you, and we can continue this, you know, questioning online.
We will, Mary Lee. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment. You were speaking of children and the importance of teaching the Holocaust to our children. I'm visiting my granddaughter this weekend. She's almost 10. And I purchased this book at the Holocaust Museum. I don't know if you can see it. It's Survivors of the Holocaust, True Stories of 6 Extraordinary Children. And it's sort of in the, you know, comic book form. And earlier last year, I presented my granddaughter with the book on Anne Frank. She read it and received it very well. Her parents told me, and she and I did not have a you know, a real discussion on this. But I'll ask her parents' permission if it's okay to, you know, let her have this particular book. And it is important to have discussions with our grandchildren. It's since I am myself a survivor that I didn't really know. I could talk to her parents, but it's difficult for me to talk with you know, with her, and I'd like to get some, you know, some comments on that.
Anybody?
Well, from the panel.
Yeah, I would thank you for having that conversation with your granddaughter, because it is it's so important. If you don't do it, she may not get the message. And, you know, Sandy can also speak to this because she does a tremendous amount of work with survivors and trying to help think about how to imbue their histories and their stories into the lives of the next generation and into the lives of the people in their communities. So thank you, Morris, for doing what you're doing. And I haven't read that book. I need to get a hold of it and take a look at it and see what I think of it. Sandy, is there anything you want to say in response?
Well, one of the things I just wanted to throw out there, I'm not sure, Morris, that it relates, that would be helpful for you, but one of the things that I think is important to note is that docents never, ever, ever, ever use any kind of simulation. And if a teacher tries to interrupt with, okay, imagine this, imagine that, you guys go stay, you know, we just kind of cut that off at the knees. We just don't let that happen. And I hope the other docents that are on this agree with me. But, you know, usually I'm using that as a vehicle to tell one person's or two people's stories from writing in that, in their lives, an incident in their lives. But anyway, that's all I wanted to throw out.
And just real quick, I have to go, but just real quick, I did tour the Anne Frank exhibit, the 3D exhibit, or whatever you want to call it, at the former Dallas Holocaust Museum. And they did not transfer that exhibit over to the current museum, which I wish they had. It was quite poignant.
Morris, can I ask you before you leave, what was your thinking when you chose to purchase that book? Because obviously you come at it, you can tell the story to your daughter. So I'm curious to sort of know your thought process about sort of what you hoped that book could bring to that conversation.
Right. Her parents, my son and his wife, they don't have the experience that I have. Yeah. So this is along the lines of what we've been discussing. You can't simulate it. Even I can't understand what my parents must have gone through, losing 4 children and being in 3 camps each. I cannot understand that. I don't have that experience. So I think it's time at least to introduce her.
Thank you.
Well, without ramming it down her throat.
Yeah.
Can I ask, and does anyone have any other questions?
Well, I actually had put in the comments about an age, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Because honestly, my daughter has a hard time even now going to the Holocaust Museum, but I remember there's a little book that was about rabbits that was introduced to children about that. And whatever they did at religious school too, really traumatized her.
Yeah.
It was a little too young. And I remember teaching it a manual, and we were going to sing I can't think of the song, but it's like a remembrance song. And it was second graders. And we kind of decided it was too much. It was, they're about 8 or 9, and that it was too soon to handle it that way. It's
Well, this is something, I mean,
it's very
yeah.
personal.
Yeah, I mean, so the exhibition at the Holocaust Museum is designed for 8 to 12-year-olds, and it was very, very, very carefully designed, and we brought in experts and all the rest of it. But that said, there is a question about what is the right age and what's appropriate. And I don't know how old your daughter is, but I will say from my own experience, and I'm not alone in this, growing up in the 70s, learning about the Holocaust in the 70s, I mean, talk about inflicting the Holocaust on people. I mean, that was the model.
Okay,
the model,
she's 42. So,
right, so the model really was to teach the Holocaust in a way that was totally terrifying. And, to make kids watch Night and Fog and, this like kind of shock value, that's really gone out of fashion, thankfully.
good.
But, my brothers and I have really vivid memories of, the way that we learned about the Holocaust in the 70s and how incredibly terrifying it was, and nightmares. And, there was very little concern in those years for appropriate ways of teaching it. Thankfully, that has changed a lot.
I'm happy to hear that part, because that sounds like she's in that same age group that would have experienced what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And even in religious school.
Yeah.
So I know that we are at the end of our time, but I just want to once again reach out and thank the Blaffer and Stephen for bringing Simon and his extraordinary exhibit into our realm, into our community, because Simon used the word intersectionality, which is a really, really important direction that all of us doing this work must take on. And to be thinking and working and talking across disciplines only adds richness to our ability to think complexly. So, I said this before too, but it bears repeating. I appreciate so much the opportunity to have engaged in these conversations with the 3 people that are on the top row of my screen, and Alex and Simon and Stephen and me, and all of you who have been in the audience and have commented afterwards on how touched you have been by the conversations that have gone on here. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I want to echo that. Thank you so much. It's been just really fascinating. And Simon, it's been so great to get to know you a little bit.
Well, what's
Love
really
your work.
Thank you so much. I mean, what's so valuable for me is to just think the work that I've been showing, it's always been in a European context. And it was very much about examining the way Central Europe and, Western Europe has dealt with narratives of the Second World War, and Anne Frank being a kind of catalyst or a kind of major figure in that. And just seeing it in the States, I just thought these conversations were really important to have, just to give it some context and to make sure it was understood as something that is a kind of serious investigation, despite it being, quite a spectacle in itself,
Yeah.
So I'm just very grateful that both of you were willing, because I know as well, one of the things, I believe in dialogue. I truly do. And I believe in talking about really difficult, complex things and being able to say things and shift your position and, have a certain level of safety in that.
Yeah.
Because we don't know. None of us know, and none of us pretending to know. And for you guys to be willing and excited to support this project and to discuss it in this open way, especially in this time where people are looking for simplicity. So that has been really, really great, and a really interesting model, I think, for working as an artist actually in different places and kind of thinking about how work can infiltrate or affect a local community or be kind of read in a local context, because actually, you know, the state where it's being shown now is the furthest geographically from the events that I'm talking about, you know, and yet not the least engaged. I'll tell you that.
Right.
Good. Well, that's good to hear.
And if I can just share a final note of thanks, and really, I think, you know, I think in a lot of ways, people assume that the museum or the curator, we have the information and the answers, and we are just conveying them to our audience. And I can tell you that is far from the truth. I feel like every exhibition that we engage with and present is a learning opportunity for us as much as our audience. And I have learned so much from all three of you. And I really want to give my most sincere thanks to Mary Lee, to Alexandra, to Tamara, to Kelly, to everyone at the Holocaust Museum. When we approached you, I can say we had a little bit of trepidation of how are they going to see this? Are they going to see this as something that's serious? You know, will they engage Simon and I in the museum in a dialogue? And you could have been defensive and you could have shut us down. And you were so generous and so open-minded and so willing. And I cannot thank you enough for that. This has been so illuminating, and it really has enriched our presentation and the way that we can think about it and what the legacy will be. And so truly, truly gratitude for all of you for engaging with us in this discussion.
That's lovely.
And I want to tell everybody in the audience that I'm going to get to work. I told Simon this the last time that we were talking. I'm going to get to work sharing information about this exhibition with some of my colleagues here in the United States, and also with some international colleagues. So you haven't been to South Africa with this yet, have you, Simon?
I'm going to plug something. I'm going to plug my book.
Oh, fantastic.
And everything. This is for those who are really interested, this is the catalogue of the exhibition from a version that I presented in Austria. It's a much more expanded version, and it contains exhibition views and what does it contain? Exhibition views and the objects that I've been discussing, and interviews and essays. So
fantastic.
I'm going to figure out how to get you a link to, if anyone's interested in ordering that. That does expand the exhibition much more. I have an idea that my assistant who's listening might be desperately searching for a link and is going to post it up here, because she's been doing that throughout the thing. So if you are interested in that, stay on for a little bit longer, and there might be a link popping up with a way to get hold of that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Oop, there it is.
There it is. Okay.
Perfect. I'm going to click on it.
Well, thank you all once again. Thank you all to the audience for joining us. Thank you to everyone who joined us for part 1 and part 2 or both parts. Thank you. And please visit the Holocaust Museum Houston. They're doing wonderful work. Come visit the Blaffer, support your museums. And like our panelists agree on, make things complex.
Yes.
And engage in dialogue. That's when I know exhibitions come alive for us, is when they become the catalyst for discussion. So thank you. Thank you, all of you. And please have a wonderful day.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Everybody, Stephen, next time I come to Houston, I'm going to look you up.
Yes, please. Door is open.
Simon, I hope we'll get to meet someday in person.
My goodness. Berlin.
I want to come to Berlin. Mary Lee, let's put that on our list.
Yeah, we're going to be going to the UK, so that's a short hop across the
little jump. We'll come see you. We want to see your studio.
Yeah, please
All
do.
right, Mary Lee and I are due to be in another meeting, so we're gonna.
Okay.
Adios.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, Kelly.